Welcome to a virtual history tour of Port Fairy. My name is Glenn, and I'll be sharing with you a brief snapshot of the town's history. You might be wondering what all these local adults and school children are excited about. This photo was taken in 2012 when Port Fairy was voted the most livable town in, the universe, and the #1 town in Australia. Now that really is something to shout about. We'll start the tour by going back in time when Europeans first started arriving here. Here is an early map of the landscape. The map was made around 1840. You can see some obvious physical differences. For example, Griffith's Island wasn't named, and there were several separate islands, not one. The land was flat and swampy, with many scrub and scattered trees, and basalt and limestone outcrops. There was a whaling settlement on the main island, and a few scattered buildings on the mainland. There was even a shipwreck on the East Beach, and the bay was named Port Fairy, but the river wasn't named. But who was living here before the Europeans arrived? For tens of thousands of years, two groups of indigenous people shared the land and water in the region where the Port Fairy township is situated today. The Gunditjmara to the west and Eastern Maar to the east. Together, these two groups comprises the Maar Nation. But what happened to them when Europeans first arrived in the area? This stone memorial tells the story of their demise. And many Indigenous people also died from a range of diseases introduced by the Europeans. Historians generally agree that the first massacre of Indigenous people in this region happened on the coast near Portland. It happened in 1833 or 34 in an area called the Convincing Ground. The most significant event in the town's history occurred in 1843 when wealthy Irish land investor James Atkinson purchased his special survey here, 5,120 acres of land for £5,120. There is no known photograph or painting of James Atkinson. Atkinson drew up a plan of the town he wanted to create and decided to name his town Belfast, even though the bay had already been named Port Fairy Bay. He employed another Irishman, William Rutledge, to be his real estate agent to rent and sell his land. The town flourished under Rutledge's entrepreneurship. Let's walk from the Visitor Information Centre along Princes Street to see where Rutledge lived in the town. We'll have a look at some interesting buildings along the way. Here is a bluestone dwelling made up of two semi-detached cottages. It was built in the 1860s. The bluestone is locally quarried volcanic basalt. As you can see from this map, there's plenty of basalt in Western Victoria. Here are the significant volcanic eruptions and lava flows in this region. Mount Rouse near Penshurst erupted 300,000 years ago, and its lava flowed all the way to the coast where Port Fairy is situated today. So, the basalt in the bluestone cottages is probably 300,000 years old. In 2019, the Budge Bim cultural landscape was placed on the UNESCO World Heritage List. At nearby Tayrak, there are basaltic foundations of Gunditjmara dwellings and the remains of a sophisticated aquaculture system for capturing eels using traps that are at least 6,500 years old, and that makes them older than the pyramids. 10 minutes from Port Fairy is another dormant volcano called Tower Hill. It is a very different type of volcano to Budge Bin. This is a famous painting of Tower Hill that was used to help revegetate the crater after it had been cleared by the early settlers. When Tower Hill erupted, it produced ash, not lava. You can see the layers of ash from these eruptions. The final volcano worth mentioning is Dean Mar, the only offshore undersea volcano in Australia. It is 8 million years old, and that makes it twice as old as the Galapagos Islands. Dean Mar is situated about 8 kilometres off the coast of Yambuk. 10,000 years ago, the coastline was in a different location. The indigenous people were able to walk to the island. Budge Bin, Tower Hill and Dean Mar are significant places of cultural and spiritual importance to the Gunditjmara and Eastern Mar people. Speaking of changing coastlines, there is another type of stone that was used in dwellings in the town. This stone is limestone. Here are some examples of limestone homes in Port Fairy. Geologists have discovered that a layer of limestone covers the Mount Rouse basalt lava plain. The two layers can be seen in this diagram. The limestone resulted from the ocean advancing inland as far as the highway, approximately 125,000 years ago. The evidence to support this theory is the discovery of fossil seashells in the limestone that formed on the land where the highway is situated. Let's return to the bluestone cottages on Princes Street. The white dwelling to the left of the bluestone cottages also consists of 2 semi-detached cottages. As can be seen, the number of chimneys in each building is different. The 2 cottages in the white building share a chimney. Here is another example in Gibb Street. The reason behind this design feature was the shortage of bricks to build chimneys. Along Princes Street, beyond the white building, is this double-storey dwelling. Over the front door is the year 1851. There are 4 very significant events in Victoria's history that occurred in 1851. Do you know them? By the way, this building was built by the Church of England as a schoolhouse. Emo is where William Rutledge lived during his time in Belfast. He was an extraordinary entrepreneur, and for nearly 20 years, Belfast flourished under his leadership. Unfortunately, the good times couldn't last, and for various reasons, he became insolvent in 1862. Consequently, the town's progress stagnated for many decades. Next to Emo is the Old Bank of Victoria, built in 1870. The bank moved there from a smaller premises at 15 to 17 Cox Street. The bank bought that property in 1853 for £3,000 from a man who originally paid Atkinson only £100 for the land. Today, the building at 10 Cox Street is the office of the Moyne Shire Council. Let's return to the naming of this town. As previously mentioned, Atkinson chose to name the town Belfast after his hometown in Ireland. However, the coastline had already been named Port Fairy Bay. How did that come about? To answer this question, we need to have a look at the sealing industry that began in the colony in the late 18th century. Many sealers came from Launceston and hunted seals on the islands in Bass Strait. Seal fur was exported to make hats and clothing, while seal oil was used for lamps and lubricants. When the population of seals on these islands dwindled, sealers sailed to Portland, Lawrence Rocks near Portland, Cape Bridgewater and Kangaroo Island to hunt the seals in those places. One of the sealers from Launceston was the famous Captain Wishart. Why is there a street named after him in Port Fairy? A plaque at the end of Cock Street provides the answer. The plaque states that Captain Wishart sailed into the bay and named the bay. Unfortunately, some of the information on the plaque is incorrect. Captain Wishart sailed into the bay in 1828, not 1810. And Captain Wishart's first name was Henry, not James. But he did name the bay after his ship, the Fairy. Let's travel down Wishart Street. Interestingly, the weatherboard houses on the east side of the street are single-fronted, while those on the west side are double-fronted. The oldest house in Wishart Street is Seafield, built in 1852 by Captain Lewis Grant. When 38 years of age, he brought his 15-year-old wife from New Zealand to live in Seafield, and they had 7 daughters and 1 son. Large families were pretty common in those early years. For example, James Atkinson married his first cousin, and they had 11 children. And spare a thought for poor old Captain Wishart. At the age of 40, he also married a teenage girl. But 1 week after their marriage, he died from the injuries suffered from a shark attack. At the end of Wishart Street is Campbell Street and Southcombe Park. Since 1977, the Port Fairy Folk Festival has taken place, and in recent times, Southcombe Park is the central venue for the festival's performances. Tens of thousands of visitors converge on the town over the Labor Day weekend in March to enjoy the festival's entertainment. Continuing down Campbell Street and near the intersection with Gibb Street is the police station, with a small bluestone building out the front, the old prison's dunny. On Victoria Street is George Dodds Reserve, which memorialises the only police fatality in the town's history. In 1859, Sergeant Dodds suffered a knife wound from a prisoner he was escorting to prison. He subsequently died from the injury. At the corner of Campbell Street and Gibb Street is the Merry Jig Inn, which is one of the town's earliest stone buildings. It was built around 1846. At one stage, it was extended to accommodate the police barracks, as seen in the early photograph. On the corner opposite the Merry Jig is the Customs House, which was built in 1861, when Belfast became a point of entry into the colony. Customs duties contributed significantly to Victoria's economy at the time. The customs goods shed is located nearby on the riverbank. The courthouse was designed for sittings of the Supreme, County and Magistrates Courts. Additions to the courthouse can be noted when comparing this recent photograph with the previous photograph from 1861. Today, the courthouse is the home of the Port Fairy Historical Society and a fully accredited museum. Opposite the Customs House is a memorial to the lives lost in the shipwrecks of the SS Casino and TSS Karamba. The casino served coastal towns between Melbourne and Port Fairy for nearly 50 years, between 1882 and 1932, when it sank in Apollo Bay during a heavy storm. Here is a photograph of the casino from 1920, when it was sailing in Port Phillip Bay. Further down Gibb Street from the courthouse is Mills Cottage. The middle and rear sections were built in 1841 and represent the oldest surviving wooden dwelling in Victoria. The front section was added on in 1853 to accommodate the harbour master, John Mills. John Mills was the older brother of Charles Mills, and together they became famous for their sealing, whaling and sailing ventures. Mott's Cottage is also a very old wooden dwelling built in 1842. It was used variously as a blacksmith's forge and boarding house. The glass gazebo was built to accommodate the Rutledge sundial. Mott's Cottage is situated on Sackville Street. There are over 600 Norfolk Island pines in Port Fairy. The first was planted in 1848 behind 64 Gibb Street, shown in the photograph on the left, and was possibly the first one planted in Victoria. Unfortunately, its branches were cut off in the 1960s by the occupant at 64 Gibb Street. It was a magnificent specimen and could be clearly seen from the river and the bay. And even today, the townsfolk are still pining after that tree. Let's take a walk along the river. You can access the river from Gibb Street via the laneway, which then takes you to the footbridge. Here are the views of the river looking upstream and downstream. While most of the time the Moyne River is a benign waterway, it can on very rare occasions very quickly flood the town, as happened in 1946. There is signage explaining the circumstances surrounding this tragic event. Cutter boats were the preferred fishing boats. They were designed and built in Queenscliff in 1870. They were so fast they picked up the nickname skimmerdishes. Tragically, some of the Port Fairy fishing community lost their lives while fishing. A memorial listing their names was erected at Martins Point. Eventually, the fleet of fishermen sailing in Cutter boats were replaced by the larger, more sophisticated fishing boats. The most famous tuna fishing boat, the Tacoma, was built on the banks of the Moyne River by the Haldane brothers. In 1951, the Tacoma sailed to Port Lincoln to establish the multi-million-dollar tuna fishing industry. The father of the Haldane brothers was Hugh Haldane, and he operated the lighthouse on Griffith Island from 1929 to 1952, and he was the last lighthouse keeper. Hugh Haldane made many changes to the lighthouse and its environment. He painted it white when it was originally red, and he also planted Norfolk Island pines, as well as carrying out his duties as harbour master. The cottages you can see in the photo were demolished in 1956. A shed similar to the customs goods sheds can be seen on the opposite side of the river. It contains a very special lifeboat. The lifeboat house was originally erected on the pier in Port Fairy Bay, opposite Battery Hill. It houses the oldest Australian-built boat and the oldest self-righting and self-draining lifeboat in the world. The lifeboat was built in 1857 in Williamstown. Here it is, the famous lifeboat stored in the lifeboat house, and also being rowed on the Moyne River by an enthusiastic group of volunteers. The other boats of similar size to the lifeboat were the whaleboats. Here is a picture of a replica of a whaleboat, which is usually moored in the river near the lifeboat house. A group of volunteers can be seen rowing the whaleboat. The mother of the first whaler in Port Fairy was Mary Reeby, who figures on our $20 note. Her second son, James Reeby, and his business partner, Joseph Penny, started whaling from Griffiths Island in 1834. However, they were unsuccessful, and John Griffiths took over from them. Griffiths was an experienced whaler from Portland. He had his whaling crews operating from Griffiths Island for about 10 years. The plaque shown commemorates his life and can be found on the island. On permanent display in the Courthouse Museum is a wonderful selection of whaling equipment. Whale oil was used for lubrication and illumination in the 19th century, before fossil fuels were discovered. Here are 2 whale oil lamps. And finally, the print shows whaling crews hunting southern right whales in Twofold Bay. Griffiths Island has been the home for thousands of years to migratory short-tailed shearwaters, or mutton birds, from Russia that come to the island to breed. You can see a mutton bird sculpture near the rotunda at the entrance to Griffiths Island. Whaleboats were used to rescue people from ships in distress in the early years. However, the famous Manby rocket launcher apparatus could also be used to rescue people. The rocket house behind the lifeboat house has the rocket launcher apparatus. The other important maritime vessel in Port Fairy was the lighter, which was a flat-bottomed barge used to transport cargo between ships and the river harbour. In between the river mouth and the bay is Battery Hill. In the 19th century, there was a genuine fear that the Russians would invade the colony. 3 types of cannons were sent to act as a deterrent to any possible invasion attempts by foreign countries. Here is one of the 2 80-pounder shell-firing cannons on the top of Battery Hill. 32 and 68-pounder cannons were also sent to Port Fairy. These cannons fired cannonballs. Leaving the river and walking up Cox Street from Dip Street, there are many heritage buildings with interesting histories. On the western corner of Wishart and Cox Streets is the first brick house built in Port Fairy. It was called Coringal Manor and was built in 1888. The house was also the first to have a bay window, a tessellated veranda with iron lacing, and a polychrome design of different coloured bricks around the windows. It also had Venetian blinds in the windows. Next to Coringal Manor was the town's telegraph office, built in 1858. The telegraph revolutionised communication in Australia. It was the internet of the times. The time taken to send a message to Melbourne was reduced from days to minutes by the telegraph. Morse code was the language of the telegraph. When the telegraph merged with the post office, the building became the home for the police constable. There were some interesting crimes committed in those pioneering days too. For example, if you were found guilty of stealing a horse, you spent several years in jail. Such was the importance of horses in the early years of the town for work and travel. Most settlers in the early years of the town were either Protestants, Catholics, or Wesleyans. Sundays were spent attending church services. However, if a policeman overheard you swearing on a Sunday, you would immediately be arrested and imprisoned. Facing the magistrate on Monday morning, you would invariably be found guilty and fined £2. That's about $300 or $400 in today's money. Also shown in the photographs are 2 schools, the Consolidated School and Brame House. All these structures shown are magnificent examples of basalt bluestone buildings. We have now arrived at the intersection of Cox Street and Sackville Street. Apart from the road surface, very little has changed from the early days of the town in terms of the buildings on each corner. The Stag Hotel was built around 1847 and had a dining room, 5 parlours, 30 bedrooms, a billiards room, and stables for 20 horses. It was used for other purposes in addition as an inn. The Bank of Australasia was described as the handsomest house in the town, universally admired for its taste. The post office delivered mail several times a day. William Green, alias Codrington Leviston, was a local bushranger who used to hold up the mail coach to the west of the town. The area is named after him, Codrington. Note the last of the town's original hitching posts is located in front of the white and brown building, which has had a variety of functions and until recently was where the National Australia Bank was located. At the other end of Sackville Street, at the corner with Bank Street, is Fiddler's Green, a very popular recreational area used all year round. Bordering Fiddler's Green is the lecture hall, built around 1880. It has a plaque explaining that the site was also used for the Belfast Temperance and Philharmonic Society. A quote describing what the town was like in the early years stated, "The moral condition of Belfast isn't rated very highly due to the all-prevalent habit of intemperance," which roughly translated meant that there was a drinking problem in the town. Of the many pubs that came and went in the town, the most famous have survived. The Star of the West was where squatters preferred to stay. A famous quote from the time described the prominent balcony as a wide, capacious promenade, commanding views of the finest scenery, and was frequently the scene of acrobatic performances by funny squatters on the burst. It hasn't changed much since it was built in the 1850s. The Oak and Anchor was formerly the Royal Oak, and it was the Royal Oak where Madam Eva Evans and her entourage of young ladies performed and entertained the local patrons. The Stump is reputedly the oldest continuously licensed pub in Victoria. The Victoria Hotel tried to introduce poker machines into the town, but failed much to the delight of a majority of locals. We have now returned to the Visitor Information Centre where our virtual tour began. Located to the right of the Information Centre is the Port Fairy RSL. In the early years of the town, the public baths occupied that site. Men and women were able to access the public baths, but not at the same time. Also, inside the public baths, a woman could hire a comb, a brush, a mirror, and a towel, and receive assistance from a female attendant. This cost the woman sixpence. And for sixpence, a man could also hire a comb, a brush, a mirror, and a towel, but could not receive any assistance from a female attendant. Eventually, the powers that be finally came to their senses and said, when properly organised, mixed bathing is quite decent and does no harm. To the left of the Information Centre and towards the rear of Railway Place near Regent Street, the town's railway station and train connection to Warrnambool was established in 1890. As you can see on the map, the train line crossed Regent Street, Bank Street, Cox Street, Gibbs Street, ending up on the riverbank. And people enjoyed hopping off the train and into a cooter boat for a sail along the river and out into the bay. Unfortunately, in 1977, this railway connection to Warrnambool came to an end. The railway goods shed is all that is left. It has recently been renovated. From the photographs, you can see where the railway station was located. By 1977, the town had its own reticulated water supply from an underground aquifer, and so the town finally had its flushing toilets and tap water. But more significantly, the first Port Fairy Folk Festival was held in the Botanic Gardens in 1977, and the town's fortunes suddenly took off. Its popularity has grown ever since, culminating in that famous award in 2012. You've probably been wondering when the town's name changed from Belfast to Port Fairy. Well, that happened in 1887, when the locals decided they preferred the name Port Fairy for their town and not Belfast. If you would like to find out more about Port Fairy's history, there is a booklet called Snapshots of Port Fairy's History on sale here in the Information Centre. It is a 60-page booklet jam-packed with photographs and narratives about each photograph. The cost of the booklet is $15. The centre also offers a Grand Slam tour of 4 of the most important heritage buildings in the town. During the tour, you have an opportunity to have a look inside these buildings. It's a great tour for the winter months when it's cold, wet and windy outside. And there are 3 other virtual tours that can be accessed on the Information Centre's website. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed touring around Port Fairy.